Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. For new listeners, welcome. For our longtime listeners, you'll notice this is a bit of a unique format with a very special guest. I'm joined by Jason Paul, an attorney, political strategist, and candidate for chair of the Democratic National Committee. Jason has a remarkable background from leading campaigns across New England to authoring Trench Warfare, Politics in the Tinder Era, which I want to know more about that. Many of you have told us you want to hear directly from insiders about challenges and opportunities within the political system, and we're excited. I mean, I can't tell you how excited I am to have Jason here to share some of that expertise with us. So, Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an excellent topic. It's really hard because on the one hand, you're completely right that we are overloaded with outrage. On the other hand, on a day like this, it's hard not to be outraged. So I'll do my best.
Right. I mean, I do talk to people about that like outrage is an okay thing. Like maybe sometimes we should be more outraged, right? But there's also this idea of kind of just swimming in it isn't necessarily effective, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for listeners, I just want to say that on Jason's website, he lists a number of his policies in his role. That's in his role as the DNC chair candidate. And Jason may not be happy about this, but I wasn't going to go over all those one by one, but I do want to make sure I let listeners know about that. And the website for that is paulfordnc.com. Do I have that right?
Yes, absolutely. And no, I think that, I want to broaden the discussion to the things that, your listeners care about.
Yeah, Jason's also got his book I mentioned and also a Substack, which is actually quite interesting. So I'll make sure all those links are in the show notes.
Thank you very much.
So, and by the way, I know that you have media issues. So if as we're going through this, you feel like I'm just not getting this right and asking the wrong questions, feel free to bring that up.
No. Okay. My media issues are not with most podcasters or not with most journalists. My media issues are with sort of the politicization of political journalism. It used to be bad. It's now political journalism has never been the best part of journalism. And it's always been horse racy and kind of shallow. Politico has made it horse racier and shallower. And the bottom line is that when you have a debate between DNC chair candidates and your primary goal is to get them to say something bad about the sitting Democratic president, and that's like your mission, and when they won't give you what you want, then you're mad at them. That's no good. But that doesn't mean that most journalists ask good questions. It's not the media is in writ large terrible. It's just a lot of the political journalism is very gotchy.
Yeah. So, going on from what you were just saying there about, adequately covering, Biden's accomplishments. I mean, I guess, acknowledging that the media isn't a propaganda machine and it's not really supposed to be a mouthpiece for the government. I'm curious what you think, the media could or should have done differently related to that.
Well, I think in general, the media started to get an emotional feeling that people were not happy with the economy. And when they got that emotional feeling that people were not happy with the economy, they began to build that into all of their questions. So in the piece I wrote following up the forum about the Politico Forum, I talked about Dana Bash's question, the second question that in Kamala Harris's first interview, the one that she did with Walz. Dana Bash asked, "What are you going to do on your first 100 days? What do you want to do?" That's a great question. And then she asked, "But people are not feeling the economy. What do you say to those who don't feel the economy is good?" And that sort of baked into the sort of the key question, is the economy good or not? The sort of the feelings of the economy was bad were baked into a lot of the journalist questions throughout the entire process. The economy is bad. What are you going to do about it? Not sort of, the economy is either, a lot of your previous guest on one of the shows was like, "Oh, well, the economy is really good. I don't know why people are so upset." And then the other and then the post-election show is we really lost because of the economy. And I think that that frame that the economy was like bad carried through in a lot of the questioning. So the questions were predicated on that premise. And I think that to a large degree, that premise is not super good. And I think this is basically one of the core how you deal with the Trump era in journalism and failures is that 33 to 40% of the country thought that Trump won the 2020 election. There is no basis in any fact for the possibility that Trump won the 2020 election. So when you started off at the beginning of this whole process, the beginning of Biden's term, you had at least a third of the people who, based on nothing factual, were predisposed to loathe, despise, hate, and be against anything he wanted to do. They were chanting, the joke, let's go Brandon. I'm not going to say what they were actually chanting, but the joke was let's go Brandon was right at the beginning of the Biden administration term. That sort of negativity that existed amongst that portion of the population will feed into questions about, is the economy good or not? Because those people were never going to say the economy was good, except now we're going to have the exact same economy, and those people are going to say the economy is great. You're going to ask them right now, and the economy is fantastic. The economy's never been better. I don't know what you're talking about. The economy is awesome. So when framing the question of how is the economy doing or not doing, the press bought into a negativity frame. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues that, inflation didn't hurt people's pocketbooks. It doesn't mean that everything was perfect. The sort of core struggles of ordinary Americans were not fixed by the Biden administration. They weren't fixed by the Trump administration. They weren't fixed by the Obama administration. Sort of the hollowing out of the middle class has been an issue since Reagan, and nobody's really, stemmed the tide. The Clinton administration moved things in the right direction. The Obama administration moved things a little bit in the right direction. The thing about the Trump administration that I say that almost no one else does is that the Trump administration continued the Obama economic policies because he couldn't get his own economic policies except for the tax cuts and more spending because he needed the sequestration to go away, which was both military and non-military. So ultimately, but that hasn't ended, but it didn't get dramatically worse. I think a lot of people, if you talk about, their economic conditions, is the job that I get and the wages I earn, that's stuff that I did. And the prices that I go to pay, that's stuff that Biden does. But if the summer before this election, we had the most travel check-ins at airports ever. So the behavior of people was not screaming, we're economically real. We're the worst, this is the worst it's ever been. And if you don't pull out those little kernels, then you get into a frame where the economy is bad. And then, so that would be where I would fault them. But it's not, I agree, it's not the press's job to everything is wonderful, but sort of basic. So on the actual factual basis, if you knew the right answers to the factual questions, you voted for Harris, sometimes by 40 points, sometimes by 20 points, but the coverage overall was just slanted just enough so that it wasn't, you could read stuff and be confused. So that is my main fault there.
I know these are the kind of questions I know you're probably a little bit tired of, and they might be touchy with your candidacy. But, in terms of, you've talked about how, the press kind of hammered Biden a lot and took the focus away from those accomplishments. But some of those concerns you could argue were valid, right? And we sort of saw the performance at the debate. So there were some questions about his fitness for another term. So, do you think the media should avoid those kinds of things, even if they were maybe it was information voters should know, and how do they kind of find that balance?
Here's the question that I would want the journalists who focused on this to focus on. What was the evidence that Joe Biden's diminished capacity, however you define it, was having an impact on the policies of the United States of America? If you could show Joe Biden is like too out of it, and therefore, Sweden and Finland didn't trust us to go into NATO, but they did trust us to go into NATO. And, or Joe Biden did this and then that led to that. But there is not a lot of question that the federal government under Joe Biden functioned at a very high level. So the question is, was it going to not function at a very high level if Joe Biden had another 4 years? Because then he would not have been able to do it. But almost no one has, for me, ever done a story. Joe Biden is out of it. Here are the consequences. And since there were never, to my mind, ever really any consequences.
Well, I think one consequence you could argue is, we look to these presidents as, I don't know, what am I looking for? The word of sort of just like a stand-in for sort of national, pride, or maybe none of these are quite the right words I'm thinking of. But I sort of think like, Reagan, a lot of people didn't really care what Reagan did, but he just looked good doing it. And when some of those cases, like particularly the debate, Biden just doesn't look good. Like you're worried about the guy.
Yeah, that's totally fine. And that's a valid concern. But the question is, now you get into scales. Trump says everything he says with incredible amounts of energy and vigor. It's just half of it is complete nonsense. The other half of it is just mean-spiritedness. He did, there were if you play he said the wrong thing cognitive error game, you could say the same things about Trump that you said about Biden.
That's true. There was a lot of the word salad was never called out, right?
Right. And so the point is that when you're, not to mention that he was an adjudicated sexual assaulter. I mean, that happened. That was adjudicated. Traditionally, I think the press did a lot of alleged, and, I think this press still cast doubt on that, even though it was adjudicated by a court, because one, they were a little bit afraid that Trump might sue and Trump might be mad, but also they didn't see that as their job. But when something is when something is adjudicated by a court, that means that it's no longer a matter of, oh, he said, she said, but it's like kind of that moves from he said, she said into a fact. And it's worth weighing. And I agree that the debate was sort of really, the debate was really bad. But one of the things is the debate was so bad that rather than, okay, bad debates happen, let's see how he performs, the press, the New York Times, threw him out the plane the very next day. Right out the plane, get out of the race. And when the New York Times threw him out the plane, that was the end of it. There was all this sort of oh, it was George Clooney, oh, it was these leaders, oh, it was Pelosi. The reality is that when the New York Times threw him out the plane, that was the end. That was the end, because the constant drumbeat of drip by drip by drip by drip by drip was too much. Now, do I think that at the end of the day, that was probably right and he was unrecoverable? Probably it was. But, the level of things before that was so primed on this, leaving us that, go back and watch the State of the Union that he gave before the debate performance. If you go back and watch the State of the Union, you're not going to think, well, this guy can't possibly handle being president. So that's all I would say, is that the scale and the size of it is what I would object to, but not sort of if the question was at this point Joe Biden potentially too old to have another term in terms of I'm not like, how dare you say that? What a ridiculous thing to say. The press was mean to Joe Biden. Of course he was. It was a legitimate concern, but it's the size of the concern versus the size of the concern on the other side, which
Right.
they didn't make that size of the concern the same.
Yeah, you feel like a balance wasn't there. One of the things is this is kind of more media and journalism at large. And we always think of them as this cornerstone of democracy. They have this duty as the fourth estate. But, in this modern world, we have a lot of challenges with sensationalism, polarization. This distrust in media is a huge issue. And people don't seem to have a good sense of what journalism is, like the foundations of it. Like, we used to learn about the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why. And where do you think people kind of lost sight of what journalism is? And is there a way to kind of bring back some of that trust?
Journalism in America kind of had the same trajectory as like America in America. And what I mean by that is after World War II, we were like it. Everyone else's industrial bases were destroyed. And so we had an incredible amount of run where we were a lot of the only game in town and got exceptionally rich as a result of being the only game in town. But the Japanese and the Germans' industrial centers weren't going to be destroyed forever. Ultimately, the Cold War was going to end, and it wasn't as good as much anymore. And to a large degree, a lot of the power of the American newspaper and then the American television station they were the dominant incumbent only game in town. And sort of once it could become the case that you could get your quote unquote news from people who agreed with you and told you what you wanted to hear, a lot of people chose to then do that and not bother with sort of the traditional journalistic enterprise because, and then there was clearly a concerted effort on the part of the right to delegitimize mainstream journalism as a means of just working the refs to get a little bit of an advantage in elections. And and somewhat understandably, that was a reasonable strategy that I might have done too had I been in their spot. And it is sort of that there might have been some, I don't think bias, but sort of some, the Democrats are culturally closer to us, and therefore we write stories that slightly reflect that, I think is valid. What the major problem that happens now is you've got that went from basically, I didn't like that call, or the refs can be unfair to us, to everything the refs do is a bunch of unimaginable lying. And one of the major problems is, to some degree, everything the refs do is lying. The actual facts that are the underlying argument of the thing, those facts, because they're reported by journalists, become non-facts. So, there's nowhere this is more true with all of the Trump stuff. That sort of how did, of all the things that he definitely did that now courts have said that he did, and, prosecutors have said what he did, all of that stuff gets thrown, initially you hear about it in the mainstream media or the traditional media, and then it's a lie because it was in the New York Times. It's a lie because it was in the Washington Post. And it's like, well, no, because It's just that's the place where people found out that fact, but it was still a fact, and it wasn't a fact because the New York Times said it was a fact. It was a fact because the court said it was the court said it was a fact. How do you get that all the way back? I mean, I think a large premise of my campaign is that you can't. And so Democrats need to adjust to the fact that you can't and build new things, both in the media space, but also potentially outside of the media space, because you need to have one person talking to another and you can't trust any filter beyond that. It's an expensive and complicated process. I would think that if you wanted to start, the way you would really need to is, new local, primarily online, but with some print copies, funded journalism that was nonprofit, but was able to be seen as above the fray enough that it could build trust before it got tarred with, a political feather. But one of the problems is, you know, getting someone who, you know, almost, this is where you get wealth concentration problems. So the kinds of people who can do this are the people who have, multi-millions or billions of dollars. And the people who have billions of dollars, when, they get a little, when they are worried about losing their defense contracts, get a little bit squirrely about, democracy dying in the dark. Well, now democracy can die somewhere else. Speaking of the Washington Post, Bezos.
Right. Well, and the LA Times as well. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? That it seems like that's a really bad sign for journalism.
I think it's a very bad sign for believing that billionaire owners can save you. But I think the question is, I think.
Right. I mean, I've had people say, well, they expected Jeff Bezos to be essentially Rupert Murdoch for the left, right? And isn't how it turned out.
Right. I mean, he wasn't, because he didn't want to be. I think one of the major things, and this is on funding, on all these things, to a certain degree, what needs to happen at that elite level is, and this is like an amazing, I don't know how this is working out, but I'm from West Hartford, Connecticut, and we had a kosher grocery store that was going to close. And everyone was really upset that this was like an institution in West Hartford. It had to stay open. And so basically all of the 50 families who could afford it, all bought in and ran it as a consortium because it needed to be saved. And I don't know whether they took a bath on it or not in the end, but they were all, none of these people, nobody's losing their shirt because they all did it at as a consortium level rather than as a one person level. And I bring that example up because to some degree, if you want to save journalism, the country's sort of Jeff Bezosian billionaires can't own the thing by themselves outright. But if they owned the things, as a cooperative that is independent and they all put in their 50 million a year for the same thing, then it's harder for, Trump to be like, I'm going to go after all of you. And also sort of, you don't feel like, this is your tax for getting to be this rich and this powerful, but you can pay it at, an amount, at a taxable level, not a ownership, this is my life level now thing. Because when you do it as this is my life now, this is not where, Jeff Bezos didn't want to be Rupert Murdoch wanted to be Rupert Murdoch of the right. Jeff Bezos wants to be the Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And then thought, well, so I'll buy a newspaper. What's the harm? It'll be good. I can spend some money. But then he thought, oh, this business will work out, this will be profitable. And ultimately, it wasn't profitable. And people who build profitable empires don't decide, oh, okay, here's an unprofitable thing. I'm going to keep propping it up because it's important. A lot of people think, well, if it's important, should make money. And if it doesn't make money, then it ultimately can't be important. And I think that's foolhardy, but I think a lot of that is, but that's sort of the model of how you would do this. But, I will admit, my job is to figure out how to fix the Democratic Party in the media landscape that we have and get those people to invest in sort of the grassroots, some of the same people invest in the grassroots partisan things I want. I'd rather get them to do that than I would get them to build out the local media. But it's a complicated question about which of those things you want because, basically, how do you better inform people? Because better informed people vote for us more. So how do we get better informed people? And sort of how do we get better informed people? Sort of the relatively fastest and cheapest that we can. And even though one of the problems is that even though the things I start proposing have billion-dollar price tags, it still might be the fastest and cheapest way to get a more informed populace because you inform the populace by, you bring someone cookies, and then as you bring them cookies, there's a little bit of the news in the tin foil of the cookies. So to some degree, is that a better way than, here's your newspaper?
Well, actually, that's a great lead into sort of my last media question, which is, this kind of rise of independent media. I was surprised, and kind of the decline of traditional media. And I was surprised that you said earlier about that people are more informed if they listen to more or received more mainstream or traditional media. So how do you see this kind of shift toward independent media? And I guess for creators like myself, what do you think we can do better to serve society and contribute to a more informed public?
So here's what the polling said. If it was newspapers writ large, it became like a 70-30 pool. If it was traditional broadcast, it was 55-39 for Harris. If it was cable news, it was like 4 points for Democrat, or it was 4 points for Republicans. It was close. Basically the Google, online, and nothing were the places where Trump dominated. So I think most of the people who are doing this level who are now into listening to a podcast about these things, who are into a Substack, I don't know if they still have a New York Times subscription, but the odds are pretty good they have a something subscription to the news that is not just that you're more supplemental than like replacement. It's when it becomes replacement that it becomes a challenge. But I don't think in most cases it's replacement. I think I really think it's just keep doing it. And I think ultimately finding the one thing I think is particularly important is these ecosystems need to be promoting of each other. So it's the one thing the thing on the right has, and Donald Trump did a phenomenal, horrifyingly good job of this, is if you were on the right and you had an audience that was like in the hundreds of thousands, Trump would go on your show. And by Trump going on your show, he built up their branding, their ecosystem. I will say if elected chair, I'll try and get you a member of Congress. I can't promise, and I'm probably not going to get elected chair, but just in saying in general that the way that you sort of build up the other side of either the other side of media or just even the side of let's learn more side is by platforming each other, treating each other, and sort of not sort of, I think really clearly one of the major problems can be there is a lot of competition amongst sort of, my goal is to be where you get your political information from, whether that's Simon Rosenberg or the Pod Save guys or on down the line. My goal is that you get your information from me. And so I don't want to be, this is an old story. I don't know how true it is, but it's an old story I think is really important. So there were some New York members of Congress African American members of Congress, who helped Southerners do freedom rides and do voter registration drives. And then some of those people were like, oh, can we do a voter registration drive in your community? And they said, again, this may be apocryphal, but they said, no, the voters that we have now vote for me. So we don't need any new voters because the ones I have now vote for me. And if I have new ones, then who knows what they're going to do. So we don't need you to do a voter registration drive in my community. Thank you very much. It may be apocryphal, but the reason I mention that is that there's a lot of that mentality in the cross-pollinating democratic political / even sort of nonpartisan intellectual podcasting world where it's like, I'll bring on great guests, but I'm not going to, they're probably not going to put you on Freakonomics because maybe you're like, people might want to listen to you more than now. And so, but when you don't create that ecosystem whereby you're growing and building each other's audiences, that's more self-referencing and building community, and then than it is to be competitive. But it's, there is plenty to go around, but you have to have that mindset that there's plenty to go around and not have the mindset of I've got to get what I can out of this, ecosystem. And that can be challenging for people who really want to, how big they are in the pot, how big they are is more important. They want to be the guy or gal, but admittedly, mostly the guy.
Yeah, true. Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, and I need to take that on more myself. I have started to do more of that, of like do some of that cross promotion with shows in similar spaces, which there aren't that many in this space either. So it's kind of hard. Yeah, well, I know I've really kept you a lot longer than we talked about, but I was going to finish with one thing. I talked in the beginning about how a lot of people are struggling right now. They're like almost in shock about the election result, and they're feeling discouraged. And like there's nothing they can really do to make a difference. I've seen that kind of sentiment a lot. Now, you've kind of set a high bar for the rest of us in terms of engagement as a strategist and now as a candidate for DNC chair. And we're obviously not all going to be able to go that far. So what advice would you give the average person, who feels pretty disheartened, but how can they maybe find meaningful ways to re-engage?
So I would say find a Substack that you like and read it. Sort of, there are some I don't immediately have like, maybe I'll get back to you with recommendations. I don't want to like just start throwing out names, but just find one Substack that you like and read it. I would say finding a way to, engage in your local level with something that matters to you all, is a good plan. I would think I would probably encourage like reading some foreign news, even the foreign news that is about us. So like the BBC, what the BBC says about us is probably more likely to be accurate and less likely to be this gotcha-y because they're not as emotionally invested in it. And that's that's the place to start, is just, and then, obviously, one guy I absolutely love on these things, is Timothy Snyder from Yale. And it's really important that you don't obey in advance. That's one of the most, because a lot of a lot of power that sort of more autocratic-y people gain is given to them by you being sort of I don't want to get in trouble, so I'll just start not. But I would not do that. And just then it's and then just what feels right to you, and don't do more than what feels right to you, and don't make people try and make you do more than what feels right to you, but also do the things that feel right to you. That would be my advice.
Well, I think that's great. Yeah, it's good advice. I appreciate it. Jason Paul, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time.
Absolutely. It was a great conversation. I got into this because these ideas are really important and we need to think through them, and we need to think through them hard. And I really appreciate people who want to engage in that. I agree that you both have to be outraged all the time, and it also becomes like pointless.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll definitely look forward to some of those links. I'll make sure we have all the links in the show notes for everybody. So again, thank you so much. And for those who would like to hear more from Jason Ford, the full interview is available on our Outrage Overload YouTube channel. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.